and friends and friendly faces from the international new music community and our scene here on the island of Ireland. I'm going to introduce our first panel, if you'd like to welcome them to the stage. Brian, Lucy, Fergal and Karen. And for the next little while, we're going to explore why audiences need to listen and engage with music, why we feel so passionate about making sure that audiences hear this music that we want to thrive, and to maybe tease out what motivates promoters and programmers when it comes to working with composers and working with certain performers. So we have a wonderful panel from right across the country, people who have been engaged in this very question, some for many, many years. So I'd like you to first welcome Brian Carson. Brian is the Chief Executive of Moving On Music, also has such a huge and long history of the promotion of music in the north of the island. He was at one stage the jazz officer with Arts Council Northern Ireland. He is also, and I feel very lucky in this, a member of the Board of Directors of the Contemporary Music Centre. Please welcome Brian Carson.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome on behalf of the northern part of Ireland. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Brian Carson. I'm the Chief Executive of Moving On Music, which is a not-for-profit promotions company that I set up some 21 years ago. Ever since I can remember, I've enjoyed listening to music, and I'm a firm believer that music is there to be listened to. Some people might think that it can be wallpaper or some sort of social experience, but I've found personally that active listening is incredibly rewarding. It's an even transcendental experience, and I realise that I am fortunate to gain so much pleasure from listening to music. I also believe that the relationship between an audience, musicians, and the music is a symbiotic one. When it's all working together, it's a life-changing experience. Apart from being an avid listener from a very early age, I first became involved in music in an organisational sense in Belfast in the late 1970s through a visual arts collective, believe it or not, called Art and Research Exchange, which was aligned to Joseph Beuys's Free International University. Most of the people involved in it were young, artistic community activists trying to find an alternative to the sectarian hatred and violence that was taking place in the north of the island. Although I wasn't a practicing visual artist, I and others were given space to explore passions for arts such as music. It was very underground, but we had a building, and there were rooms in the building which we turned into galleries and rehearsal rooms for mainly punk bands. As you probably know, the punk scene in Belfast was huge, and it went right across the sectarian divide, and it was very positive. My first music promotion, I'll always remember this, it was a mixed show, and they asked me to choose somebody that I'd like to work with, and I chose the Beau Gamelan Ensemble, who were nothing to do with Beau or Gamelan. They were aligned to the composer you'll all know, Cornelius Cardew, and his Scratch Orchestra. Also on that bill was an artist who's become incredibly famous. Her name is Mona Hatoum. She just has a major retrospective at the Tate. So, I mean, all these people, it was fascinating working with them. I also worked with Helen Chadwick and Alistair McLennan, the great performance artist who's based in Belfast. So I was always interested in the kind of underground nature of everything that was going on, and I find it difficult today that there really isn't an underground, because I can't think that the art scene could be healthy without one, but that's by the by. These experiences give me a confidence to take things a bit further. I'd become very interested in contemporary jazz music and improvisation, and realising that they were completely absent from the music scene at that time. I set up a music collective called Project Jazz in Belfast, and we were successful in gaining some public funding from the Arts Council, and believe it or not, some commercial sponsorship. Imagine that, to put on contemporary jazz and improvisation. You wouldn't get it today. So we put on a series of concerts, and the musicians came from all over Ireland and from the UK as well. And we, to our surprise, people turned up in their droves, and we realised that we had created a neutral environment where people could come together to listen to music primarily, but also to meet each other, and places where our backgrounds and our religions didn't matter. And that was the great thing to me about music then, when I was young, that it was a great leveler, and it was a great way of meeting other people and hearing other opinions. So that's sort of my background in listening, and from 1995 to the present, I've been involved professionally in music. I started a company called Moving On Music, which mainly services all kinds of music. We cover probably about 80 promotional dates a year, and although I started, my background would be jazz and my interest is in jazz and improvisational music, I realised that we couldn't have a successful promotional company if we stuck with that, dealing with such a small population. And so therefore the company today does all kinds of what I believe is really quality music, and we tour stuff north-south as well. We're involved in continuous professional development, commissioning, arts development, education and outreach. And our Belfast programme features, we've discovered that clustering events is probably the best way to attract audiences. It makes it easier, and it's easier to market to them, and especially listening audiences, because although our tours might be seen as quite mainstream, they have to be, because if to take music into the rural community, it has to be, to my mind, very accessible to get an audience in the rural community. Whereas in Belfast, which is a bigger place, of course, we can experiment quite a lot, in fact, and we can challenge an audience. And we found, with clustering of events and setting up little festivals, that we can engage an audience. I never thought I'd do this, although I've been involved in jazz, and we used to put on a lot of one-off concerts, and I worked for the Belfast Festival at Queen's for many years. I never thought I'd really run a jazz festival myself, because there was too many issues to deal with, and I wouldn't go into those now. But 4 years ago, we set up a little festival called Brilliant Corners, which is jazz and improvised music. And last year, although it was very modest, nearly every event was full. And people were really engaged with it. And some of the music was incredibly difficult. In fact, one of the concerts, which was featured the great saxophone player Tim Byrne, and a band from Dublin called OKO, who were working with them. I mean, they just took no prisoners at all. In fact, about 30 people left, but we had about 150 people in, which was surprising in the first place anyway. But that's okay. And I don't think it did our reputation any harm at all. I think contemporary music in all its forms is an incredibly hard sell. There's just absolutely no doubt about that. But I think it is possible to engage an audience through various mechanisms, which might be, as I say, clustering and festival events, attached education and CPD activities, composition, competitions, commissioning of local artists. But in some ways, I think the best way to keep generating audience is to try and get some of this music into schools, primary and secondary schools. Because I think that really young kids, as my colleague Brian Irvine has proved year on year, can be really engaged, with music that we might feel is incredibly difficult. They love it. And I think, more and more we need to try and find a way to get some of this music into early years music curriculum. I know that's very difficult, because music is always kind of one of those subjects that's sidelined. But another way, I think, of bringing people to contemporary music and having a good listening audience is working with, if you get the opportunity, to work with people who can perform it at its very, very, very highest level to a standard that sort of removes a lot of barriers. And we've been lucky enough to work with such a group over a number of years now. They're called the Jack Quartet. We'll be touring them again in November. They play some really exciting new music. And we found that because they've built up a reputation for playing to such a standard that people, most of the events that we have worked on them with had full houses. Now, we're only talking about 120, maybe 150 people if we're lucky, but that's a result for us for sure. And I think that I think a lot of the points that Kevin made, I completely agree with. I think that contemporary music it can be seen as a difficult prospect, but I think that if we keep working away, we'll continue to, if we can maintain our audiences, I think that, like in the past, we'll be able to build those audiences, but it's going to take time, and I think that will be done through just people talking together at conferences like this and networking and exchanging ideas. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. Our next speaker is Lucy Rolton, and Lucy is a cellist by profession, but she is also the joint artistic director of London Contemporary Music Festival. And she's now based in Berlin, so we're particularly delighted that she was able to make the journey after a very, very busy weekend of performing and being involved in lots of stuff in Berlin. So please welcome Lucy.
Thank you. I hope you don't mind if I read from a script. My morning was very early, so I thought best to save too many mistakes and follow what I intended to speak to you about. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Yvonne, for introducing me. As Yvonne has already mentioned, I'm founder and co-director of the London Contemporary Music Festival, which has been running yearly since 2013. And I'm also the founder of Kammerklang, a new music series, which runs 8 times a year and has existed for the last 7 years at a venue called Café Otto in East London. The London Contemporary Music Festival brings music across all progressive genres to a large audience, all under one roof. LCMF was born from the idea to give audiences a new listening experience, not just an experience of hearing, but one to see and to feel and question, and at times join in. We also focus on encouraging a new sort of engagement between the performer and audiences through creative presentation and through breadth of programming. With the intention to include rather than alienate new audiences, we focus on programs that are diverse and reach people from all corners of the music and art worlds. Our audience also experience dramatic architecture, dance, art installations, and film screenings, all under one enormous roof. Each year we take over a different venue in London, typically somewhere huge and unknown to our audiences. For example, a multi-storey car park, a concrete testing bunker, a carpet factory, spaces that aren't normally used for new music. These are places people are excited by and want to explore. Typically, we attract nearly 500 audience members a night and have been broadcast on BBC Radio 3 also. Kammerklang, the other project I have been involved with for a long time now, is a new music series that runs nearly every month in front of a loyal, regular audience that makes figures between 80 to 150 people a night. The focus with this series is to combine audiences and performers from the new music, improvised and experimental music scenes in an intimate and open-minded environment. By day, the venue is a cafe with tables and chairs, and at night, one of the only regular venues in London that will house non-commercial music nearly every night of the week. When I began Kammerklang in 2008, then at a tiny sports bar called Charlie Wright's, I was looking for a platform on which the performer and the audience could have better connection and therefore break down the often sterile presentation of a front-on stage and rows of seats performance setting. As young performers with a passion for new music, we, alongside composers in our network, needed a new audience to listen to us. Without this engagement, our explorations wouldn't have a home. It wasn't the first hall, it wasn't the festival hall or the Barbican, and it wasn't a church or university concert hall. It was essential to find a place to take risks and mix genres, so we could expand our listening crowd, develop new collaborations between art forms, and have a more open-minded environment to try things out. In this vein, the question, why must our audiences listen and engage, is answered from a performer and creator's point of view. An audience that isn't engaged won't keep coming back. And without a real and developed group of followers, I don't know how the music and experience can keep existing. There are many factors that have kept the new music scene thriving and people engaged in London, and one to focus on with regard to this talk today is the position of promoters at a grassroots level. It is now a common situation to hear new music in unconventional spaces, but I think London 8 or more years ago was a time when performer and composer-led collectives and small organisations began actively looking for ways to enhance the listening experience, and I think because of the abundance of grassroots level new music events going on in the city, and because there has been good support from national funding bodies for some of these events, there is a healthy new music audience in London, I believe. The explorations of these smaller events then have fed into the programming of major concert halls, where organisations such as London Sinfonietta, the old Ether Festival that existed at the South Bank Centre, and Ilan Volkov's Tectonic Festival, to name a few examples, can continue to mix brand new modern repertoire alongside better-known electronic acts, improvisation and visual arts. It all contributes to the sensation that big new music groupie collectives are constantly emerging in London, huge families of listeners who are as essential to the scene as the curators and performers are strong in numbers. There is even a coffee table book that has been published recently called Pictures of People Listening to Music. It features photos of young and older people at popular and obscure music events in settings ranging from DIY pop-up gigs to institutional venues. It highlights a mass and a community and exemplifies that this is perhaps the place to be seen. I thought I could just show you a few photos. Jonathan, are you around? Just to show you a few very rough photographs that I have still from a few of the LCMF events in London in the last few years. I'll very quickly explain. This was our very first year in a car park in Peckham. We did start out great sound system. That's all I can say. Well, the buttons don't work. Anyway, I'll come back to that. Thinking about other factors that link to the necessity of audiences to engage in the idea of community and new connections, is the idea of community and new connections and what they can take away from them, the audience that is. In my work with Camaclang and LCMF, it has been key to provide a setting that allows for a counterflow between the performer and the audience, and give a space for all to discuss and question and meet again and build on something. Through presentation, we soften the divide between the music on the stage and the listener on the outside, with the hope that this encourages a better sense of involvement for both parties. I think it is crucial to take care of our audiences if we are to depend on them and their presence to keep the music alive. As a programmer, I treat the presentation of music to an audience as a celebration and an experiment and a discussion between the performer, composer, and audience. I encourage a two-way experience because one is dependent on the other. The question, why must our audience listen and engage, is answered by this same idea. Music without an audience doesn't live beyond the walls of its creator. And whilst this might not be a problem for the creator, for an organizer who wants to extend the great work of composers to a large audience, it is essential to have an audience that feels included and engaged and considered by those who invite them to listen. My concern is that I don't see enough new music festivals and promoters taking enough care to engage their audiences. I think there is a risk audiences can feel alienated, particularly when this niche and often academic form is stuffy in its presentation and often narrowly programmed. Just as other extracurricular forms develop with technology and adopt fast-growing multimedia assets and embrace social media outputs, new music should also keep up with the tools that bring people in to listen. Because I'm not sure that the concert hall is where the future of new music lies. With my colleagues at LCMF, setting and presentation has been one of the priorities in what we do each year. We give an almost immersive experience, bringing everything from unknown new composition by unknown composers to well-known pre-existing ensemble performances, from brand new collaborations and commissions to major names from the international scene. As part of all our inclusive programming, we feature many forms side by side, with the aim to engage each audience member in at least most of the evening's programme, if not all. We aim to attract a wide audience by presenting a unique programme that is unlikely to have been heard before in such a constellation. We also take care to engage a non-musical audience through the presentation of, to list a few examples from past years, traditional Japanese no theatre, durational dance work by Tino Segal, an art installation by Michelangelo Pistoletto, and film screenings of works by Ryan Trecartin. Our motivations here is not just to think outside the musical box, but to open the discussion with our audiences about artistic statements that connect across the art forms. By doing this, we do as well, of course, bring a non-musical crowd to our events, which to me can be a good spanner in the works. And finally, with the focus on independence for our audience and wish to keep things accessible, we make sure our tickets are affordable across the board. And to do this, we raise funds accordingly through national and private funding, rather than depend on ticket sales. This way, of course, we're not restricted to programming sellout artists and can focus more on a relevant program that makes sense to our audience at the current time. And Jonathan, could you help me again? Thank you. Just to show you four.
Let's see. There. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Yes. This was our most recent LCMF in Westminster University in the basement there. It used to be a concrete testing factory. This is an installation here by Ellen Fullman, which remained in the space for the whole week, and it became the centrepiece for the whole week, the visual centrepiece, and also as a performance it was a very special focus point to the programme. Our old venue from last year, where we presented the Parmigiani retrospective with an enormous 42-channel Genelec surround sound system. I think, technical hitch. There are a few others, but let's move on, I think. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Great to hear about your exciting performances at the London Contemporary Music Festival. And I suppose there are a few similar headings that are arising, both from Kevin's wonderful and inspirational words earlier and from the few presentations we've had. The presentation of the music that we want to thrive is coming up again and again. the quality and skill of the performers. And I'm interested that Lucy's referred to finances and the price of tickets as well. So these are all things we'll come back to, and there will be a little bit of time before the lunch break as well for audience participation. So maybe make your notes as we're going along. Our next speaker is Karen Dervin, and Karen is the Artistic Director of the Kaleidoscope Night, and she'll tell you what that's all about for those of you that don't know. She is also those unique string players that are viola players. She is also a former music journalist. Please welcome Karen Dervin.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the CMC for the invitation to be part of this fantastic discussion. Thanks to Kevin Volans for a very inspiring keynote, and I'm glad that he opened the floodgates somewhat to more controversial topics. So I'm here in my capacity as a curator of the Kaleidoscope concert series. I'll briefly explain what that is. Kaleidoscope is a salon event that takes place once a month in Dublin City. With a view to creating an alternative space for classical music performance in Ireland, the series was founded in 2009 by two musicians, violinist Cliona Ryan and cellist Kate Ellis. The venue they chose was a small room in a licensed club in the city centre called Odessa, where the audience was packed in, 80 strong, in a most higgledy-piggledy, un-concert hall-like fashion. The performers, dressed informally, regaled the audience from a small, same-level corner stage. The programming formula was simple: to represent the four big genres of classical music: Baroque, classical or romantic, early to mid-20th century, contemporary, and at the end of the night, typically, a non-classical element, be that jazz, traditional music, etc. The duration of each contribution was typically between 10 and 20 minutes. So the elements of that formula worked well. The series is still going strong 7 years later. My colleague Leoba Petrie and I took over as the curators of the series in January 2014. I personally came to the role as an avid attendee and fan of the series, and as Yvonne mentioned, a professional viola player who had performed at the series numerous times. Leoba and I still hold fast to the basics of the formula, but we are now in a slightly bigger venue, the Bellow Bar, which houses 100 people capacity. And the programming approach is slightly more malleable in that an evening may not always feature one genre in favour of the facilitation of a second piece of another genre, one that may fit the bill for various reasons. In the context of contemporary music performance, what kind of experience does the Kaleidoscope series offer the listener? The series has a strong reputation now as a platform for the contemporary, particularly that of Irish making. It is the balance of genres and the careful weighing of the durations and formats of each contribution that makes our audience not only open to the contemporary music element or elements, but very often thirsty for it. They thrive on the challenge of hearing, for instance, Bach, Berio and Brian Irvine side by side. The series was originally billed as a journey through music, and it is the mapping of this journey for which I, as a co-curator, now take responsibility. And here's where it gets deeply interesting for me, when I examine the true nature of the listening experience that I am giving to the audience. Is it the case that the series' reputation precedes itself, and that when a listener walks into the Bellow Bar, they have already placed their trust in us, the curators, and in the series, and will therefore more readily take the journey that Leoba and I have mapped out for them? This is essentially, of course, the notion of branding, that favourite term of the marketing guru, which I'm loath to use. Nonetheless, I have to acknowledge that the Kaleidoscope brand is quite a cool and trendy one because of its informality and its fusion edginess, maybe. So the question is it this cool that makes the listening of a challenging contemporary work more appealing to the listener than if they heard it in a more typical concert hall setting? The prevailing answer to that question, I believe, is yes, but I do still think that we are fostering, to refer to Kevin's keynote, serious listeners for serious music. So I am a violist, and this hat informs a little of the main thrust of this paper. You can spare me the viola player joke, by the way. So, since I regularly encounter contemporary music at the coalface as a performer, I am therefore one of the conduits, so to speak, for composers, and to invoke the title of this talk, it is at this coalface that I occasionally see naked emperors wielding get-out-of-critical-jail trump cards in their hands, probably because they have no pockets, because they're naked. So it brings me to the main position of the paper. Some of the points I want to raise apply to the general field of contemporary music, though I am specifically, I admit, bearing in mind some of the more avant-garde and very experimental compositional approaches in this paper, perhaps typically the remit of the fledgling composers, the new graduates that Kevin spoke of. It is in this latter field that I think the listening experience can often take on other aspects. And it is to some of those aspects that I would pin the trump card or emperor's new clothes analogies. I should clarify that I don't mean either of those analogical terms to have strictly derogatory connotations. These extra musical aspects may include theatricality of presentation, or the extreme pushing of the boundaries of musical language, or the exploration of very complex technical ideas. In the face of that, the listener's immediate right to a purely subjective response can be somewhat compromised where these aspects are the primary motivation of the work. Now the listener may be asked to read or listen to a very complex program note by the composer in order to inform their listening or experience of the work. So what happens after that if the listener simply doesn't get it? What do they derive from their listening experience? And are they still entitled to a subjective response to the work? If I, as a listener or a reader of a musical program note, don't get it, am I more likely to cover up that feeling of being intellectually intimidated and say, yeah, that was brilliant, than to admit I didn't get it? And in this gap between the composer's manifesto and the listener's potential lack of understanding, is there an opportunity for intellectual profiteering? And is this gap the trump card I spoke of? A composer whose language and approach is so complex and who can wax lyrical and abstractly about this language and approach puts himself into something of an untouchable realm, be it deliberately or not. And in this intellectual empire, which may or may not be built entirely or somewhat on artifice, no one can say that emperor is naked, because the emperor is holding a trusty get-out-of-critical-jail trump card. And the card says, you don't understand my art because my art is so complex or revolutionary. This approach is, of course, found across all contemporary art genres. Some would say that contemporary visual art is pretty much founded on this approach. But to come back to our listeners, which is what we're here to discuss, essentially, where does that trump card leave them? Depending on where you're coming from, you can say it does or it doesn't matter where the listener is left. The compositional exercise in itself can be a purely artistic one. And of course, there is a place for art's sake. Perhaps it's 30 years from now that the listener will get it. Or equally, there's a chance that there's nothing to get. But that's fine too. It depends how one values one's listener. And as a performer and a curator, I not only value my listener, I depend on them. Let me just flip the coin to ask, what does a listening audience demand of our contemporary composers? Do we like to deal as listeners in the currency of genius? I refer here to an article by Jan Stafford in The Guardian in 2004, which a brief Google search unearthed me. Looking briefly at how the greatest composers of music were received in their time. Stafford compared Bach, Mozart and Beethoven in this light and presented the case that Bach and Mozart, while greatly respected and admired, were subject to harsher criticisms typical of their musical eras. For Beethoven, the legacy of the greats before him and the romantic celebration of all that was progressive, extravagant and heroic provided the backdrop to his creative epoch. And his admirers quickly exalted him to an untouchable status of greatness. As Stafford puts it, Beethoven's singular status was enabled by his time. The Romantic age created the cult of genius. Romantics demanded demigods. There are certainly many composers who exist in our time who have achieved demigod status, who are given the genius stamp. They can do little or no wrong as a result of this status, and the rewards are enviable. And if you have to play a trump card or two, or perhaps wear no clothes to get to that status nowadays, who could blame your aspiration? If the audience demands a demigod, do you deify yourself and adopt the embroidered cloths of genius? I mentioned being at the coalface of contemporary music performance. One of the more cynical comments you hear at the coalface may be something like, "This could have been written in 4/4, but I guess it wouldn't look as fancy on the page then." I've worked with many composers who I believe know fully what they are doing in their writing. I've worked with many who appear not to fully know what they are doing. And I've worked with many who make it appear to know what they're doing by writing something in the most complicated fashion they can possibly think of. Regardless of the quality of the work, it is still the performer who invests him or herself in communicating the work as best they can. The performer is the middleman, and so effectively is the concert promoter or the curator. The audience will never know that the performer or performers have gone to perhaps undue lengths to make the piece playable, even if the playback button in Sibelius makes it sound playable. But how much credit does the listener give to what the performer is contributing to the listening experience? How does the listener, in the experience of a new work, distinguish between the merit of the work and the merit of the performance of the work? That's an age-old conundrum, of course, but if the latter merit far greatly enhances the piece, then are we looking at that aforementioned gap for the composer from a different angle? To conclude, as a curator of the Kaleidoscope series and as a performer, my endpoint is the listener. It absolutely has to be the case. If performers and promoters don't have a listening audience, we cannot do what we do. The composer's endpoint is not necessarily an audience, of course, but where it is, and where the musical message is deliberately as complicated or alienating as possible, I dare say that to serve perhaps the abstract or of a specific award or funding source, it's typically the performers and promoters who have to present or frame that message to the end point of the listener. Therefore, it's the performers or the promoters who put their necks on the line to the audience, I think. Composers will compose and manuscript paper won't refuse ink, but it is promoters and performers who stand before their audience saying, I believe this music is worth sharing with you. Even if it's a world premiere of a piece, I've never heard it before, I have to trust the composer, I have to trust my own subjectivity and convey that to the audience. So I have to have the conviction when the occasion arises to decide, I don't think that particular emperor is wearing any clothes, and choose not to present a naked emperor to my audience, even one wielding a few trump cards. I'm not on a mission to denounce anyone. I'm simply in the business of serving my listeners and keeping audiences enthusiastic for live music. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Karen, for your words of wisdom this morning. We're moving on now to Fergal Dowling, who is a composer and is also one half of the team called Dublin Sound Lab, along with Michael Quinn. So Fergal will tell you a little bit more about what Dublin Sound Lab do and why they felt the need to form this organisation to present works to audiences and why they feel passionate about these works.
Something online on the website.
Yeah. So we got down there.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll try and find a little online sample to show you some of Dublin Sound Lab's work in a moment. But first, of course, thanks to Kevin for his inspiring speech, and thanks to Yvonne and CMC and everyone involved in this for giving us the opportunity to talk about music production from the audience's point of view, from the listener's perspective. I think some of you might have had a title from my presentation already that appeared online called Why Here and Now. That's maybe not completely relevant depending on how this goes. Maybe a more slightly threatening phrase, we're all in this together, might be more appropriate. I feel a little bit of a fraud here because, as Karen said, I'm director of Dublin Sound Lab, which is a music performance group, but I don't consider myself a music promoter as such, and I was a little bit surprised to see Dublin Sound Lab listed on the Contemporary Music Centre's website as a music promoter. This is a problem we've had for ourselves trying to describe ourselves and what we do. Of course, as Yvonne said, I'm primarily a composer, but in our role as a group, we saw ourselves perhaps as an artistic project rather than something practical and useful like a music promotion group. And as you know, composers hate doing anything vulgar like promoting or anything practical. Dublin Sound Lab was, as Yvonne said, is really just two guys at the moment and has been since we were formed in 2008. That's myself and Michael Quinn, who's here today as well. At the moment, Dublin Sound Lab is expanding to take in more composers and other people who have been involved with the group over the last year or so. So the form of the group is changing. But originally, when we formed the group, it was a little bit like the end of Act 1 in those Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland films, where Mickey Rooney says, "Hey kids, let's put on the party here ourselves." We had played music together when we were undergraduates in college, and went our separate ways. And we met again many years later, and we got talking about the type of music that was available in Dublin at the time, the type of programming that existed, and the type of programming that we wanted to hear. And we felt that there was a gap there, not a gap in a market, but a gap in our listening experience and our concert-going experiences. And we thought, well, we played before, let's try and play together again. So we had kind of conflicting roles in becoming a music performance group or a music production group. We didn't set out to necessarily please another audience, we set out to please our own tastes, but we also wanted to find works that we could perform ourselves, and we also wanted to find other people that we could perform with. So we didn't have a singular goal, but multiple conflicting goals. And in our production experience, we've kind of continued this flexible organisation where we don't necessarily it's just the two of us. We hire in other musicians. We buy music off the shelf and we put on a gig and play it in the old-fashioned way, like a music ensemble would. But we also get in other players and we present the other player or the other group. For instance, we had Lucy Ralton joined us in Music Current earlier in April. But we regularly take in other groups and we don't necessarily play with the players. So we do function something like a music promoter in that sense. So we're a little bit of all these things. We're a performance group, we're a production group, okay, hands up, we are a music promotion group as well. I'd just like to show you a quick example of some of the work we have done, of one concert in particular, in fact, it was like two concerts called Places and Responses. I'll see if I can find it quickly. Okay, I'll see if I can find, actually I'll just get the files off my hard drive. Sorry for this. Sorry, what do I need? Oh, I just spelled it wrong.
I can't see him. Maybe Jonathan will.
Oh, very good. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so this is what Kevin mentioned about flawless performances. So this is how not to do it. So these conflicting elements in our production plans, in our aspirations, in our programming aspirations, means that we're trying to find pieces we can play together. We're trying to find works that we can involve our colleagues in and people we like to work with. And we're trying to find works that inspire us and bring music programming to Dublin that we don't normally see. And this idea is particularly central, that we want to make works that wouldn't be made by anybody else, that nobody can go and buy off the shelf. They can't go to the CMC and find a single work on the library and take it out and just reproduce the instructions. We want to make entirely new works that the audience has never heard about before. So we want to make a relationship between us, the performers, other composers, and the city. And by the city, of course, I mean the audience as well. So the project I'd like to just briefly talk about is this project called Places and Responses. For this project, we invited Peter Ablinger to come to Dublin and make a special version of his one of his well-known pieces, Three Places, but Three Places Dublin. We also asked Peter Ablinger to work with some younger or emerging composers and to have a workshop with them. And then we asked some other composers who we'd worked with before to respond and make a musical response to Ablinger's approach. Very briefly, Peter Ablinger, for this piece, Three Places, he makes recordings of noise and the noise response within spaces, and then composes a relevant pitch material for players to improvise on in the spaces. So the audience and the musicians move from space to space, resounding each building as they go. So here's the first photo you can see here is the ensemble playing in the fruit market in Dublin. But we started out in the Temple Bar area, in the Temple Bar galleries and studios, which is a vertically orientated space. It's 4 floors orientated around a central void, and the entire building is made of concrete. The third space is St. Michael's Church. You can see at the end of this journey. So all the buildings were functional buildings that are still in use. So first an art gallery, a fruit market, and then a church. And we were kind of walking back in time, as well as walking north across the Liffey. We were walking from a 20th century building to a 19th century building to, I think most of St. Michael's Church is 18th century, but originally medieval. Here's a picture of Peter Ablinger rehearsing with the musicians in the fruit market. The audience gathering outside Temple Bar galleries and studios after hearing the first performance and about to walk along the quays and past Capel Street. I don't know if you can see them so well. And into the fruit market and finally in St. Michael's. The next day following that work, we had a workshop with some younger Dublin composers with Peter Ablinger. And then we had another kind of processional work, or another performance that involved a processional work with 4 invited composers. That was Gráinne Mulvey, Pierce Hoban, Rob Canning and myself. And we each wrote a response to Peter Ablinger's approach, but this time in and around the Temple Bar galleries and arts studios. For this production, we wanted all the players to work, all the composers to work together to make a unique response, or to make not just a unique response, but an integral response, so that we were choreographing a larger work, or an evening's experience, so to speak. So to begin this process, we had a site visit to the space, and we decided how we were going to choreograph the movement of the audience through the building and around the building. So Pierce Hoban was given the very confusing task of writing a piece for audiences approaching the building and entering the building. So he wrote a two-part piece that had two performers inside the space, and another the first part of the piece that the audience had to download and listen to on the way to the building. As the audience were drawn up through the building listening to Pierce's piece, then we had a piece by Gráinne Mulvey, which is perhaps the most standalone piece. It could have been taken out of there and put into a concert, and in a normal stage front presentation. Then my piece had the players disposed throughout the building with real-time sampling and recording the players as they played, and then replaying it on loudspeakers arranged throughout the building. So the audience are dispersed over all the floors and around the musicians, so they're watching them from above and below. This is a shot of Pierce's welcoming piece. And finally, there was a piece by Rob Canning which uses this his own software and recording devices, so he can attach portable recorders to instrumentalists, and they can wander anywhere and broadcast over the internet back into the space. So in the middle of my piece, I suppose, the musicians struck up Rob's Canning's piece and left the space, walked out of the building and around Temple Bar, broadcasting back into the space, and then returned into the space to close the concert. So this was I can play a little snatch of this the last few minutes. Oh, can we hear this? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Okay, I won't play that then. So this is the type of work that perhaps best typifies the aspirations of Dublin Sound Lab, that involve not just writing work and sending it out into the world, but that really tries to engage with the audience in a creative way and get the audience directly involved in the piece. Perhaps rather much like the Ablinger, but here involving multiple composers as well, and trying to make a piece that's not just relevant for that moment, but relevant for the city as well as the wider city and the wider audience. So that's the why here and why now. Okay, thanks.
We're running a little bit behind time, and I do want to give you the chance as well to come in on this discussion. I suppose I'm just interested because we have heard, I suppose, case studies from a number of different areas around the country, and also from London. And you know, it seems to me that really the quality of experience for the listener, for the audience, is based on the commitment of you as programmers and strong belief in the artists and the composers that you program. I'm interested, and you know, we're moving on to different questions as the day goes on. If you want to kind of maybe share a little bit more on the responses that you've had from particular projects that you've done, or particular programs that you've programmed, or your festival. And you know, we're talking about the why, so people are coming to specific things that you're programming. And what kind of responses do you get maybe at the end of concerts, or on the walking trail of the Dublin Sound Lab project? What do people say? They've invested this time, they've invested their trust in you as a programmer, and I'm just interested maybe for the people here to see what maybe responses you get?
Can be extremely variable, and there doesn't seem to be any particular reason for that. I mean, we do our utmost to engage an audience. That's for sure. We have a really brilliant person who works on our marketing, does all those things, and sometimes there's some. I mean, if you live in a small city like I do, it just depends what else is on. So it can be. It's very hit and miss. But we've done our utmost to engage an audience. But as I said, the experience with the Jack has been really good because of their profile, I think, and the way they've approached things, and there's been some, we've got them into the university and stuff like that. We've managed to build an audience for, they nearly everything they do is new work, and they'll be touring again in November with a whole set of new work here in 4 dates on an All-Ireland tour. And I think it really is down to, Kevin's point about standards and keeping standards really, really high, on trying to keep standards as high as possible in everything that you do. And that comes down to the choice of the artist and knowing that the artist will be able to perform the music in an incredibly convincing way. Because sometimes, and I bring that up because sometimes I hear new music being performed and you know that it's not... The commitment's not there, but it's beyond the performers, perhaps. Yeah. No, I mean that's not to denigrate what those people are trying to do, but it doesn't work.
Can I take the mic, Brian?
Yeah, of course.
A very brief, funny. Is that coming through? No. Funny story about a performance in Ennis that we put on by a contemporary composer whose name I'm not going to mention, very well respected. We wouldn't have programmed her otherwise. But a very outspoken lady in the audience there said during the piece, I can't, out loud, she's sitting in the front row, I can't believe we're sitting here listening to this. So that was her opinion. She felt very strongly she wanted to share it, and you have to roll with the punches and say, okay, we take your point on board. Just a brief tale.
I mean, I think this comes down to trust. So I think trust takes time. And you mentioned that at the end of your 10 minutes, Brian, that you're kind of fairly hopeful, I think, for the future if we kind of keep plugging away at this. But I do think it takes time. I mean, Moving On Music is 21 years old. Kaleidoscope's been around for 7 years now. It's like any friendship, any relationship. It takes time to build that trust, and for audiences to commit to go into something that they may not know the artist or the composer's work. You're reasonably new, both London Contemporary Music Festival and Dublin Sound Labs activities as well. How many years now?
Since 2008.
2008. I mean, do you feel, I mean, the quality of experience that the listener gets from both the projects you're working on is wonderful. Do you feel that audiences, that more people are trusting you? That's the way I'm going to phrase that question. So it's not about quantity, it's about quality, and the quality of experience is of course there for the people who are going along. Are more people wanting to be part of this quality of experience is what I'm asking you.
I hope so. I hope they are. I think there's an...
Or is that even important to you?
It is important. It's absolutely essential. We want to communicate with people.
Are you happy with the people who are there saying, I really love this, I've had a wonderful quality of experience, but I'm not going to tell 5 of my friends?
Well, look, if there's 80 people there and they enjoy it, that's great. I love that. If there's 200 people there and they enjoy it, I love that. I mean, I don't know. Can I love it more?
Yeah.
I suppose I can.
But is it happening? Do you see people trusting Dublin Sound Labs programming?
They do. I think. I mean, we do tend to think of this in a kind of marketing kind of way. But I think what Lucy was saying. Lucy described the audience as a kind of family, and not just engaging with the audience, but it's a. Sorry, you didn't describe the audience as a family. You described the whole network of performers, composers, and audience as a family, as a network. And I think this is a new way that audiences are actually approaching music. It's not just something in London Contemporary Music Festival. I think it's a new type of way that promoters as well are meeting their audiences and thinking about their audiences. There was an interesting article by Christopher Fox in The Guardian, I think in November at the end of last year, when he actually talked about going to a Camera Clang concert, and he introduces the article with this little sketch of some lads on a night out and just passing by the window and seeing what's going on inside. And actually, it's Peter Ablinger again doing a very quiet Peter Ablinger piece. They go off on their way to a night out on the tiles, I suppose. And then he takes us into the concert. So he starts the article by describing someone happening upon a concert. But he talks about, he uses an interesting phrase about when I were a lad, if people were interested in music, they went out and formed an ensemble and performed music. And he gives the example of London Sinfonietta as a modernist example. But he says in the last 10 years, if young people are interested in new music, they go out and form a concert series. And this is when we have representation stuff that's here with Kaleidoscope Night, with Camera Clang, London Contemporary Music Festival. Dublin Sound Lab is maybe not quite in that, but we're minnows really, because we only do a couple of events a year. The amount of programming we do is very tiny compared to the other programmers on the panel. But Christopher Fox gives an example. Gives other examples of other performers. I can't remember, but there's a lot in London music we'd like to hear. I can't remember who else he mentions. Non-classical, perhaps as well, which is not, it's not a performance group, but it's like a series of events that you're kind of buying into the brand. And there's lots of groups like this in Dublin as well, like Ergodos, which we can't really say is an ensemble. It's like it's like some kind of vague thing. Perhaps the way we've trouble nailing down what Dublin Sound Lab is. But these groups are like a concert series. They're making, it's perhaps more like a brand. Or maybe something like what music genres used to be, when people said they were a heavy metal fan or a punk or a reggae guy, that they're a Kaleidoscope guy. And it's something they can identify with.
Kaleidoscope guy. Do you want to come in there, Karen?
No, I was going to say I have to leave.
Okay. We're going to wrap up. I just want to ask you, Lucy, why you feel that audiences are so healthy for London Contemporary Music Festival. You saw a gap in what was being presented. I mean, it's such a big city, so much on offer. Yeah. Why do you think that the things that you're committed to, the things you're passionate about, why do you think so many people are also...
I think if you're just speaking about that comparatively with other cities, then London is the most happening city to be having an eclectic program such as we have. You don't have to. Is this on? Yeah. I mean, somehow we don't do any publicity for the festival, and you can do that somewhere like London because it is fast. People are moving quickly. People tell and talk about new things. They want to be seeing the next new thing. I'm sure we have lots of tourists coming to our events as well. We have an international program, so it's quick. It's appeal. There is appeal, and although it's like I feel it's a great success, we're also in the most perfect place in the country to be doing that. So it's completely open. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to throw it out to the floor now just before we break for lunch, and Jonathan will give out the microphone. Do we have the first question?